was short, my hair was long. Caught somewhere between a boy and man. She was 17 and she was far from in between. It was summertime in northern Michigan.
This is Larry Connors USA. Larry Connors USA.
I do like that song by Kid Rock. So I did not mention a moment ago that Vice President Harris was actually in the Rose Garden along with President Biden today. She was seen, and she finally made some remarks at a press conference in the process of introducing Biden, actually, is what she was doing. And Diane, one of our listeners, sent an email to me. Harris spoke, but she talked about gun control, not the border. Hey, Harris, when are you going? Now, she didn't say a word one about the border, did they? All about the gun control thing. We do know, of course, that what Biden has proposed, all these aspects are going to cost us a ton of money and at the same time also going to impose more taxes. Remember, they're rolling back the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act signed into law by President Trump in 2017. The idea is to, help protect this country and Americans, but now they're in process of dismantling them using all kinds of myth also, saying that those tax cuts Trump did were just for the rich. That's a lie. Let's break this out in more detail. Joining us now, Joel Griffith. He's with the Heritage Foundation, an expert in tax law. Joel, glad to have you on board again.
Hey, thanks for having me today, Larry.
So I'm looking at, first of all, let's talk about, as we see them trying to dismantle everything Trump did, reference the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, specifically when they say that these tax cuts that Trump put in place are just for the rich. That's not right, is it?
Well, that's patently untrue. We know that the overwhelming majority of taxpayers receive a tax cut on all levels. In fact, the typical American family with two income earners and middle class range of two kids saved around $2,800 each and every year. Proportionally, relative to income, actually the middle class received more of a tax cut than those at the top. But most importantly, we saw tax reductions on businesses, which resulted in an investment boom. It resulted in the lowest unemployment rates in many generations, and it resulted in household income overall, even above and beyond the tax cuts. We saw median household income increase to an all-time record high. In fact, now the typical family here earns about $10,000 more in disposable income than in Germany, for instance. So these tax cuts had a very real impact on all levels of income earners.
But of course, now what we're facing now with the pandemic, things are obviously not as solid as they were based on some of the stats you were giving us. And imposing more taxes and raising the corporate tax on businesses, if we're going to raise the corporate taxes proposed by Biden, Trump got it cut down from, 32%, and now Biden wants to put it back up at 23%, which would be 3% more than Chinese Communist government would charge our corporations in China. What's that going to mean for corporations in being made in America, staying in America, where Trump had them?
Well, something very important to keep in mind here is that prior to the tax cuts of 2017, if you're a U.S. company and you're earning income overseas, well, you have to pay taxes in the country in which you're doing business. And then if you wanted to actually bring those profits back to the United States, you would actually pay the U.S. tax on the difference, with the U.S. tax was the highest in the industrialized world. So companies are very reluctant to bring home the earnings that they had earned in overseas business operations. And we saw the corporate tax reduced to something competitive with those in Europe and in China. Well, we suddenly began to see a flow of capital back from those countries into the United States to help business opportunities here. Undoing that is going to have big impact, not just for those companies, but for all of us who are benefiting from those jobs as well. And something else you really have to keep in mind. I understand most people, we're not huge shareholders in big corporations. We might not own even our own small companies. But when you raise taxes on these companies, you, in effect, diminish the returns on expected projects. And investors know not every project is going to be profitable. They make a determination based on what the expected after-tax return is. And when you go ahead and lower that return, which you will do across the board by increasing those taxes, a lot of those projects are going to become undesirable because of the risk involved. And that's going to mean fewer opportunities for everyday Americans as well. There's no free lunch here.
The very fact is, when every time, and it'd be great, I have no problem with folks being rich. I'd like everybody to have a higher standard of living than maybe what they have if they're really suffering. But the general line of attack has always been, the rich always get richer and the poor get poorer. And if we're not careful, that does follow that. But the jobs and the businesses that create the jobs normally come from, quote, the rich, that they do that then the monies they're spending. I remember when they originally put in the luxury tax plus 10, 30 years ago now maybe, and immediately all the shipbuilding along the East Coast stopped. But the rich, they didn't stop getting their boats. They would just go to Europe and have a boat made. It put people in this nation out of work along those shipbuilding areas.
Yeah, I think that some of our left-wing politicians, they try to use the caricature of the wealthy as Scrooge McDuck, if you remember the old cartoons
right.
from childhood. And Scrooge McDuck would have the wealth and would just keep all these gold coins in a vault, which they weren't doing anything productive. Well, those that are truly wealthy, they don't have the money in a vault. They don't have the money under a mattress or in a hole in the backyard. They've invested that money in businesses which produce more wealth each and every year. And you can go ahead and levy a tax on that wealth or levy a tax on that income and have that money to go to D.C. to redistribute. But that's not going to be creating more wealth. You're going to get a one-time boost to the politicians that get to spend the money, but we're all going to be worse off longer term. But politicians know they can just get this bias because they get the headlines for spending the money. But we need to keep in mind, if we want long-term prosperity, we need to actually be incentivizing people, and especially the wealthy.
And provide jobs. Yeah, provide JOBS. Right. Yeah. New York Times today, I get this morning slap in the face every day because I sign up for it, written by David Lenhart, as to what's big news for the New York Times and saying, good morning. What's the good morning, Larry? I always want to personalize it. He does about it. Good morning, Larry. What's the number one reason taxes on the very wealthy have declined? The fall in corporate taxes, and there begins a dirty little secret. The main cause of the radical decline in tax rates for wealthy Americans over the past 75 years isn't one anyone would guess. It's not lower income taxes, not lower estate taxes, but they fall into the corporate tax rate. And he points out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, many corporations paid about half their profits to the federal government. That's changed. That now basically there's something, according to his information here, and you have to tell me it's true, that using President Donald Trump's 2017 tax overhaul, at least 55 companies paid zero federal income taxes last year. Well, of course, that's a lightning point for a lot of folks, even if they're conservative.
Well, people look at this as if this is somehow a bad thing, that businesses are having to pay less of their money to the federal government. We all benefit when businesses have more money to invest. I wish that we could have a situation in which we can lower that rate even more, because it doesn't just profit the investors, it profits all us. When you raise a tax on a business or have any taxes at all, those costs oftentimes are borne by labor, the workers. And there's study after study that shows that much of those taxes end up getting passed along to the workers and by way of lower wages. Consumers are impacted because businesses will have to try to recoup that investment or recoup that bottom line by raising prices. And in some cases, you simply can't raise the prices, you can't cut the wages, and you have these companies that go out of business. Talk to these companies in New York State, even before COVID, that were going under because of the high taxes there. These taxes have
and the business is leaving New York because of that before it got to that point. But again, I want to put their side in play again. He points out in this article that the justification for the tax cuts has often been that the economy as a whole will benefit, but he adds it hasn't worked out that way. Economic growth has been mediocre. Incomes have grown even more slowly than the economy, so except for the wealthy.
Well, that's patently untrue, and that's not just data from the right wing. This is data from the Census Bureau, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, trustworthy statisticians that actually work for these data centers. And we know that household income, median, which means in the middle, that means adjusted for inflation, was at all-time record highs leading up to COVID. And we know that the unemployment rates are at record lows. And there's a lot of misinformation about how the middle class is doing, whether or not the middle class is worse off. Well, we have to remember, thankfully, we have a country that's growing in prosperity, and the very definition of middle class changes over time. What it took the middle class in 1965, somebody middle class today would have been upper middle class then, because the standard of living has increased overall.
Right.
And that's because we've been able to incentivize people to invest. We were becoming wealthier, while places like Venezuela, that went in the complete opposite direction, have gotten poorer.
You know, I recall one time my dad was talking about, we need to have more taxes on some of the wealthy and so forth. Then he suddenly realized he was a blue-collar oil field worker all his life, but he'd worked hard and saved what he could. And suddenly he realized he was higher up in the middle class than he thought he was, and that he was considered part of the wealthy. And then suddenly they reclassified me. And he said, I didn't really make any more. Well, sometimes it works out higher and lower at the same time. Joel, one final thing. Biden is insisting on what he's going to be able to do here, that it's going to be, as he said, the infrastructure plan will be honest, fair, fiscally responsible, pays for what we want. 15 seconds, your analysis.
Well, number one, the so-called infrastructure plan, only about $1 in every $13 actually goes to roads, bridges, and highways.
Right.
12 out of $13 amounts to a bailout of failing blue states and to items that aren't even close to infrastructure. Further nationalization of health care, preschool child care, all these things that are unrelated is really a wish list for a far-left socialist agenda that they're trying to squeeze through with the name infrastructure.
All right, Joel, again, I appreciate it. We'll do it again. Joel Griffith from the Heritage Foundation. Thanks, Joel, for joining us. Coming back, I want to go back over this MLB decision and how Stacey Abrams was trying to play both sides of that story.
You can hear podcast of this program at Larry Connors USA Facebook. Larry Connors USA Facebook.